A racist judge thinks he's delivering justice when he humiliates a black lawyer, determined to destroy her career. But just as he delivers his final blow, she speaks 6 words that make his heart stop. "I am your daughter, Your Honor." The courtroom gasps. His power vanishes in an instant. But what happens next? No one saw coming. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom creaked as they swung open. Attorney Maya Richardson strode inside, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. She had prepared for this moment for weeks. Every legal precedent memorized, every counter-argument sharpened to perfection. Yet she felt the weight of something far heavier pressing against her: prejudice. At the judge's bench sat Judge William Carter, a man whose reputation had long been stained by whispers of bias. Whispers that, in Maya's experience, had proven true time and time again. She had seen him throw the book at black defendants while showing leniency to others. She had watched him dismiss black attorneys, refusing to take their arguments seriously. And now, he was staring down at her with cold, unblinking eyes. "Ms. Richardson," he said, his voice dripping with disdain, "you have 5 minutes to present your argument, though I doubt you'll say anything worth my time." Maya's fingers curled around the edge of her briefcase. She was used to men like him, men who believed power was their birthright, men who would rather see her fail than acknowledge her brilliance. But she refused to flinch. "Your Honor," she began, keeping her voice steady, "my client has been falsely accused, and the evidence—" Judge Carter held up a hand, cutting her off. "Let's not waste the court's time, Ms. Richardson. We both know your client's kind." He stopped, allowing his words to hang in the air like a noose. The room fell into a suffocating silence. Maya's heart pounded. Her client's kind. He had not even tried to hide his bias. She stole a glance at the jury. Some shifted uncomfortably. Others avoided her eyes altogether. The air was thick with tension, but no one spoke up. No one ever did. Judge Carter smirked, tapping his gavel against the bench. "The fact remains, your client is guilty, and unless you have a miracle hidden in that briefcase of yours, this case is closed." A flicker of anger burned in Maya's chest. This was not justice. This was a performance of power, a calculated humiliation. But she had come prepared. "Actually, Your Honor," she said, forcing herself to remain composed, "I do have something." She reached into her bag, pulling out a folder thick with documents. "These witness statements prove—" Carter exhaled loudly, flipping through the papers with disinterest before tossing them aside. "Irrelevant. You really thought this—" he gestured at the evidence, at her— "was enough to sway me?" The smirk was back, more venomous than before. "You're in over your head, Ms. Richardson. Perhaps law isn't the right career for you." A hushed murmur rippled through the courtroom. Maya swallowed against the lump in her throat. She had endured racism before, had fought against systemic bias her entire life. But this was personal. This was deliberate. He wasn't just trying to win. He was trying to break her. For a moment, her resolve wavered. But then, she saw her client, a young black man, shackled and staring at her with hope that was quickly fading. If she gave up now, she wouldn't just be letting herself down. She'd be letting him down too. Maya straightened, her pulse steadying. He wanted to break her. Let him try. Taking a deep breath, she met Judge Carter's gaze. "With all due respect, Your Honor," she said, her voice unwavering, "the law is not yours to twist, and I will not be intimidated into silence." A flicker of something, annoyance, perhaps even surprise, flashed across the judge's face. He sat back regarding her with thinly veiled contempt. "You think you're so smart, don't you?" he sneered. "Let me show you what happens to people who defy me." And then, he slammed his gavel down. "The court finds your client guilty." Gasps echoed through the room. Maya's stomach dropped. The trial had not even concluded. The jury had not deliberated. He had just decided. Maya's hands trembled at her sides, her nails digging into her palms. This was not a courtroom. It was a slaughterhouse, and she was being fed to the wolves. Judge Carter leaned forward, his smirk returning. "You're finished, Ms. Richardson," he whispered. But he did not know her. He did not know the storm that brewed within her, because Maya had come prepared to fight, and she had one final move left to play. 6 words that would change everything. The courtroom was frozen in stunned silence. The sound of Judge Carter's gavel still echoed through the chambers, a death knell to justice. Maya's heart pounded against her ribs, but her face remained unreadable. She had prepared for this moment, not just for this trial, but for a lifetime of battles. And now, standing before the man who had just wielded his power to destroy her client's future, she knew it was time. She took a slow step forward. "Your Honor," she said, her voice sharp yet measured. Judge Carter raised a brow, clearly savoring his victory. "Ms. Richardson, this matter is closed. If you wish to continue practicing law after today, I'd advise you to accept your loss with grace." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The spectators watched, some in uneasy silence, others with barely concealed glee at watching a black woman put in her place. Not today. Maya inhaled deeply. Her hands clenched at her sides, but her voice remained steady. "Before you end this trial, Your Honor, I have one last statement to make." Judge Carter scoffed, tapping his gavel lazily. "Make it quick, Ms. Richardson. I have other cases to oversee, real ones." Maya lifted her chin. She would not bow to him. Her gaze locked onto his, and then she said the words that made his world stop. "I am your daughter, Your Honor." The words sliced through the air like a blade. Gasps erupted across the courtroom. A few people audibly whispered, questioning if they had heard correctly. One of the jurors dropped their pen. Even the stenographer, who had been diligently typing, froze mid-keystroke. But the only reaction that mattered was his. Judge Carter's entire face drained of color. His smirk vanished, his hands tightening around his gavel until his knuckles turned white. For the first time since she had stepped into his courtroom, he was speechless. Maya watched as a flicker of something, recognition, horror, maybe even guilt, crossed his face. "You're lying," he said, his voice quieter now. But it wavered, just enough for Maya to know she had struck the core of something deep, something he never wanted unearthed. Maya shook her head, her expression unreadable. "No, I am not." The silence was thick, suffocating. Somewhere in the back of the courtroom, a journalist began furiously scribbling notes. The bailiff, who had once stood indifferent, was now staring at the judge like he had grown a second head. Judge Carter swallowed, his jaw tightening. "This is a pathetic attempt to manipulate the court. If you think—" Maya cut him off. "You think I would come into your courtroom and say something like this without proof?" She reached into her briefcase. The same case he had dismissed minutes ago, the one he had treated like a prop in his theater of humiliation. Only this time, what she pulled out was not legal evidence, but something far more damning. She held up a photograph. A faded picture, creased and worn, like it had been held too many times to count. In it, a young white man with familiar piercing blue eyes stood beside a black woman, his hand resting on her waist. The resemblance was unmistakable. Judge Carter's lips parted, but no sound came. His past was staring back at him. Maya placed the photo on his bench. Then, slowly, she pulled out a birth certificate. Judge Carter flinched. The document shook as she laid it in front of him. It was there, in black and white. His name, under Father. The courtroom exploded. People gasped, whispered, turned to each other in shock. Reporters scrambled to take notes. Even the jury, who had sat through the trial in obedient silence, could not contain their reactions. Judge Carter's breathing turned shallow. His hands trembled slightly as he stared at the evidence before him. Maya's voice cut through the chaos, calm and deliberate. "You abandoned my mother before I was born. You built your career on the very systems that keep people like me down. And now, here we are." Judge Carter's lips pressed together. His entire being was unraveling before her. He had spent years upholding the illusion of superiority, of distance, of control. And yet, his carefully constructed world had been shattered in an instant. Maya took a slow step back, letting the weight of her revelation settle over him. The courtroom was no longer his domain. For the first time in his career, Judge William Carter was the one on trial. The walls of Judge William Carter's courtroom had never felt so small. The gavel, which once carried the weight of undisputed authority, now felt useless in his grip. His breath was shallow, his mind scrambling for control, but the courtroom was no longer his to command. "Maya, Richardson." His voice cracked over her name as if it burned his tongue. He stared at the birth certificate, the damning proof of his secret life, his past clawing its way into the present. Reporters were already writing furiously, their eyes flicking between the judge and the poised black woman before him. A woman who, until moments ago, had been just another lawyer to dismiss. Now she was the daughter he had spent a lifetime pretending did not exist. "This is a desperate stunt to undermine my authority," Judge Carter finally snapped, but his voice lacked conviction. Maya let out a short, mirthless laugh. "Undermine your authority?" She gestured to the birth certificate and the photo still sitting on his bench. "You did that to yourself, Your Honor." A ripple of tension spread through the room. The jury was no longer neutral. Their eyes shifted between Maya and the judge, their expressions tight with realization. "You've spent years condemning people who look like me," Maya continued, her voice steady, but full of a deep, simmering fire. "You looked me in the eye today and called my case irrelevant. You belittled my career. You mocked my intelligence. And all this time," her voice sharpened, "I was your own flesh and blood." A murmur spread through the crowd, growing louder. Judge Carter's hands trembled as he gripped his bench. "This is still my courtroom," he growled. "Not anymore." Maya's words sliced through the tension, and the balance of power shifted. For the first time in his career, Judge Carter was losing control. A black juror, a woman in her 40s, folded her arms and shook her head. The court stenographer was no longer typing. The bailiff looked to the other court officers, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. No one knew what to do. Then, a voice rang out. "This case is a mistrial," said one of the defense attorneys from the back of the room. Another lawyer stood. "Judge Carter should be removed from the bench immediately." A low rumble of agreement spread through the spectators. The weight of Carter's hypocrisy was suffocating, undeniable. He tried to slam his gavel, but no one flinched this time. "Silence!" he barked. Nothing. The courtroom had turned against him. Maya stepped forward, her presence filling the room in a way his authority no longer could. She lowered her voice, but the strength behind it was undeniable. "You have spent your entire career silencing black voices, sending innocent men and women to prison, and ensuring that people like me never had a chance." She took another step, closer now, towering over his power-drained frame. "But today, the world sees you for who you really are." Carter's face twisted with something between fury and panic. "You think you've won?" His voice was lower now, almost pleading. "You think exposing this will change anything?" Maya stared at him for a long moment. Then she leaned in just enough for only him to hear. "You already know it will." His eyes widened, because she was right. And then, a voice cut through the tension like a knife. "Judge Carter, please step down from the bench." It was a white court officer. A stunned silence followed. Judge Carter's face flushed red. "I am the presiding judge in this courtroom," he hissed. "I will not be removed by—" "Sir," the officer's voice was firm, "this is no longer your courtroom." Carter turned, desperate to find an ally, anyone willing to back him. But all he saw were cold stares. Disgust. Betrayal. Maya watched it happen. She watched as the unshakable Judge William Carter, the man who had ruled over people's lives with an iron fist, realized that his reign was over. He could feel it. The ground beneath him crumbling. Maya saw something flicker in his eyes then. Something she had never expected. Fear. She had won. But she was not finished yet. She turned to the jury, to the courtroom full of witnesses who had seen justice denied for too long. "I move for the verdict against my client to be overturned," she declared. It was never a fair trial to begin with. The jurors nodded, murmuring in agreement. More lawyers stood, calling out similar objections. A senior judge, who had been observing from the back of the courtroom, stepped forward. And with one final blow she declared, This ruling is overturned. The defendant is free to go. Maya's client, who had been sitting in shackles, who had nearly lost his future to a corrupt and racist system, broke down in relief. The courtroom erupted. Some cheered, others gasped. The moment was electric. And Judge Carter, he sat there, small, his gavel slipping from his grip. For the first time in his life, he was powerless. And Maya Richardson, the daughter he had abandoned, she had just dismantled everything he had built. Judge William Carter sat motionless at the bench, his face a mask of disbelief and humiliation. The weight of Maya's revelation hung over him like a death sentence. His once absolute authority had been stripped from him in mere moments, by the very daughter he had abandoned. The courtroom was still buzzing, reporters whispering into their phones, the jury exchanging knowing looks, Maya's client staring at her as if she had just performed a miracle. But this wasn't over. Maya watched as two senior court officers stepped forward. One placed a firm hand on Judge Carter's shoulder. "Sir," he said, his voice calm but unwavering, "you need to come with us." Carter jerked his arm away. "You have no right." His voice cracked, no longer the booming command of a man in control, but the desperate cry of someone drowning. "This is my courtroom. Do you know who I am?" Maya stepped forward, her heels clicking with purpose. She met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "Yes," she said quietly. "I know exactly who you are." The words struck deeper than she expected. For the first time, his anger faltered. Judge Carter was unraveling. This is a setup," he stammered, his face red with panic. He turned to the jury, to the lawyers, to the reporters in the room. "You're all witnessing a gross injustice, a courtroom being hijacked by the truth," Maya cut in. Silence. Carter froze. The truth. He had spent his entire career burying it. But now it was staring him in the face. The court officer motioned again. "Judge Carter, you need to vacate the bench. Immediately." Slowly, painfully, he rose. The man who once held absolute power now looked fragile, exposed. His movements were stiff, like a marionette with its strings cut. Maya took in the sight of him. This was the man who had spent decades destroying lives with a flick of his pen, the man who had called her case irrelevant, the man who had looked at her, his own daughter, and seen nothing but someone to silence, and now he was nothing. As he stepped down, he turned to her, his daughter. For the first time, his expression was not one of hatred or arrogance. It was something far more pitiful: regret. He parted his lips as if to say something, maybe an excuse, maybe a plea, maybe an apology. But Maya did not let him speak. Instead, she delivered the final blow. She stepped closer, her voice soft but razor-sharp. "You always thought you could bury the truth," she whispered, so only he could hear. "But now, the whole world is watching." Judge Carter visibly swallowed. And then, he turned and walked out of the courtroom, escorted by the very officers who once stood at his command. The second he disappeared through the doors, the room erupted. Some people cheered, some gasped, and others stood in stunned silence, processing what had just happened. Maya turned, exhaling slowly, feeling the weight of years of injustice finally lift from her chest. Her client, the man who had nearly lost his future to Carter's corruption, turned to her, his eyes glassy with disbelief. "Ms. Richardson," he choked out, shaking his head in awe. I don't know what to say." Maya gave him a small, tired smile. "Then don't say anything," she said softly. "You're free." The words settled between them, heavy and real. Her client wasn't the only one freed today. Maya turned toward the reporters, who were already firing off questions. "Ms. Richardson, did you always know Judge Carter was your father? Do you believe his rulings should be overturned? How does it feel to take down one of the most powerful judges in the state?" Maya took a slow breath, her heart still racing. She had spent her whole life fighting against men like William Carter. She had fought for her place, for her clients, for the justice system to see her, not as just another black lawyer, but as someone who deserved to be here. And now she had won. She turned to the reporters, standing taller than ever. "This was never just about me," she said, her voice steady and strong. "This was about justice, and justice," she paused, her eyes burning with conviction, "always wins." The cameras flashed. The headlines were already writing themselves. And as Maya stepped out of the courtroom, she knew this was just the beginning. The morning after the courtroom explosion, Maya Richardson woke up to a world that no longer looked the same. Her phone was on fire, hundreds of missed calls, texts, and emails. Her name was trending on every platform. News stations played the footage of Judge Carter's downfall on repeat. The shocking revelation that ended a judge's career. Black lawyer exposes racist judge, who turns out to be her father. Judge William Carter under investigation. Did his rulings discriminate against black defendants? Maya stared at the headlines, her stomach twisting. She had fought for justice her whole life, but now she had become the story. A sharp knock at the door snapped her out of her thoughts. She opened it to find Trey Matthews, her best friend and fellow attorney, holding up 2 coffees and a knowing smirk. "Figured you might need this," he said. Maya sighed, letting him in. "I haven't even had time to process what happened yesterday," she admitted, sinking into her couch. Trey sat beside her, handing her the coffee. "Well, while you were sleeping, the world was having a meltdown. Every legal analyst is tearing Carter apart. His rulings are under review. There's talk of overturning dozens of convictions." Maya let out a slow breath. "Good. He spent his whole career destroying lives. It's about time his actions caught up to him." Trey hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. "About that. You might want to turn on the TV." Maya grabbed the remote and flipped to a news channel. There, sitting in a dimly lit office, his face stripped of the arrogance he once carried, was Judge William Carter. The headline at the bottom read, "Exclusive. Judge Carter speaks out." Her grip tightened on the remote as the interview began. "I was blindsided," Carter said, his voice lower than usual. His usual commanding presence was gone, replaced by something that almost looked like shame. "I made mistakes. I hurt people." He paused, rubbing his face. "But learning that Maya is my daughter, that changed everything." Maya's jaw clenched. "Did it? Or did getting exposed change everything?" The interviewer leaned in. "Do you regret your rulings?" Carter hesitated. It was brief, but noticeable. Then he sighed. "I regret not knowing her. I regret the choices I made." Maya's breath caught. She expected anger, denial, deflection, not this. But was it real, or just another performance? Trey muted the TV. "So," he said carefully, watching her reaction. "What do you think?" Maya exhaled slowly, her mind racing. The judge who had spent his life dismissing black voices was now being forced to listen. He had built his legacy on power and control, and now that legacy was turning to ash. And yet, a part of her, a small wounded part, wondered if he had ever thought about her before yesterday. If he had ever looked at her and seen more than just a lawyer he wanted to humiliate. Trey nudged her. "He's going to try to talk to you, right?" Maya nodded. She knew. But the real question was, would she let him? Maya sat in the quiet of her office, her fingers resting on the edges of a manila envelope that had arrived an hour ago. No name, no return address, just her name typed neatly on the front. She had known this moment was coming. He was reaching out. Her phone buzzed. "Trey, you gonna open it?" he asked the second she answered. Maya stared at the envelope. "Did she want to?" Trey sighed. "Look, I know you don't owe him anything. But if you don't face him, you'll never stop wondering." Maya closed her eyes. He was right. She needed to see this through. Slowly she opened the envelope. Inside was a letter, written in messy, uneven handwriting. Judge Carter's handwriting. "Maya, I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even expect you to read this. But I need to say it anyway. I knew about you. I always knew. Your mother told me she was pregnant, and I made a choice. A coward's choice. I convinced myself I had no responsibility. I married a woman who fit my world and shut out the life I should have had. And then I became a judge. I told myself I was fair, that I ruled by the law, not by bias. But that was a lie, wasn't it? I saw you in my courtroom and still refuse to see you. I don't expect redemption. But I need you to know. Losing everything made me see. And I do see you now, Maya. I always should have. If you ever want to talk, I'll be here. If not, I understand. Maya's hands trembled as she set the letter down. She should have felt satisfied. He was stripped of his power, humiliated, forced to admit the truth. He could no longer hurt anyone. But deep down, something inside her ached. For years, she had hated him, the judge, the racist, the man who tried to erase her. But now, sitting before her, was something she never imagined, a father's regret. And she had a choice. Would she meet him, look him in the eyes and demand answers, make him feel every ounce of pain he had caused, or would she leave him to rot in his own guilt, just as he had once left her? Maya exhaled, reaching for her phone. And then, she made her choice. Maya sat in her car outside the small, run-down cafe on the edge of town. He was inside. Through the window she could see Judge William Carter, not the towering, arrogant man from the courtroom, but a hollowed version of him. His once pristine suit was replaced by a simple button-down, sleeves rolled to the elbows. He looked older, not just in age but in weight, of guilt, of loss, of a life crumbling around him. Maya's fingers tightened around the steering wheel. What was she doing here? She had won. The world had seen his true face. His rulings were under review. His career was over, and the legacy he built on injustice was burning to the ground. But here she was. Taking a breath, she stepped out of the car. The bell above the cafe door chimed as she walked in. He looked up. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Two strangers. But that was a lie, wasn't it? They were more than that. They always had been. Carter stood slowly, unsure. He didn't know if he had the right. Maya. She held up a hand. Don't. He swallowed hard and sat back down. She slid into the seat across from him, her back straight, her face unreadable. This isn't forgiveness, she said. He nodded, staring at the table. I didn't expect it to be. Maya folded her hands. Then why am I here? Carter exhaled, his fingers shaking slightly as he picked up his coffee. Because I think a part of you wants to know why. Maya didn't flinch. But inside, her heart tightened. You abandoned my mother, she said. You built a career on punishing people who look like me. And even when I was standing in front of you in that courtroom, you still… She stopped herself, voice sharp with years of unspoken rage. Carter rubbed his hands together, nodding slowly. I know. Maya waited. Finally, he spoke. The truth is, I was a coward. His voice cracked, quieter than she had ever heard it. When your mother told me about you, I told myself I didn't have a choice. That if I acknowledged you, my career, my family, my life, everything I had worked for, would be gone. His blue eyes lifted to hers. So I ran. And then I spent years pretending you didn't exist. Maya clenched her jaw. Pretending. Like she had been nothing more than an inconvenience. A mistake to erase. Carter took a slow breath. And when I saw you in my courtroom that day, Maya, I had the chance to do right. His voice dropped. And I still failed. Maya's stomach twisted. Because he was right. He had failed her. Over and over again. And yet, she had come here. She had come because, despite everything, a part of her wanted to know if he could feel what she had felt her whole life. And now, looking at the broken man in front of her, she realized he finally did. Maya leaned back. I spent my whole life fighting against men like you, she said. And now, you're just another name in a long list of fallen ones. Carter flinched, but he didn't argue. She could walk away right now, leave him sitting in this cafe, drowning in the weight of his own regret. But Maya had learned something over the years. Justice isn't just about punishment. Sometimes it's about reckoning. And Judge William Carter was finally reckoning with himself. Maya stood, tossing a few bills on the table for her untouched coffee. You want to know if I'll ever forgive you, she said. I don't know. Maybe I never will. Carter nodded. his expression unreadable. She took one last look at the man who had once held power over her life. And now, he had none. And that, she realized, was the justice she had been fighting for all along. Maya turned toward the door, her head held high. As she stepped outside, the morning sun bathed her in warmth. She had won, and now, she was finally free.